Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of history's strangest food misconceptions, where a fruit we casually toss into salads and pasta sauces was once considered deadly dangerous. You're standing in a medieval European garden, staring with suspicion at an unusual plant with yellow flowers and strange red fruits hanging from its stems. Your host, a learned botanist, warns you with deadly seriousness not to touch the wolf peach, explaining that several peasants reportedly died after consuming similar fruits last season. The vibrant red color seems almost like nature's warning sign, and you feel a chill despite the summer heat in this world. Without modern food safety knowledge, you probably wouldn't survive sampling unfamiliar plants that local wisdom has deemed poisonous. You're living in a time when most Europeans rarely encounter new foods, where dietary habits remain largely unchanged for generations, and where foreign plants are approached with justifiable caution. You're visiting southern Spain and Italy in the late 1500s, observing how these Mediterranean regions begin cautiously incorporating tomatoes into cooking. While northern European countries maintain firm suspicion, this regional variation in acceptance would persist for centuries, creating a curious tomato divide across the continent that still somewhat influences European cuisine today. The tomato, this strange, shiny red fruit, possesses no context in European culinary tradition. No place in the existing framework of foods considered safe and appropriate for consumption. You peek over the shoulder of a 16th century scholar attempting to catalog tomatoes, according to ancient Greek and Roman texts that obviously contain no mention of American species. You listen as Spanish descriptions of tomate get translated and mistranslated and misinterpreted across Europe. In some regions, tomatoes become confused with similar-looking foreign fruits, including some that actually... You're living in an era before understanding of food safety, where distinguishing edible from poisonous plants often comes down to trial, error, and folk wisdom passed through generations. Europeans had learned through bitter experience to be wary of unfamiliar red berries, and fruits many native European species with similar appearances were indeed deadly. Wealthy estate gardens begin growing tomatoes as ornamental curiosities rather than food crops. The plants have established themselves physically in European gardens, but remain culinarily marginalized in most regions, simultaneously familiar as ornamentals, yet foreign as food. This peculiar position, present but not fully accepted, created the perfect conditions for myths, misunderstandings, and fears to flourish around this innocent fruit that would remain poisonous. In the European imagination, far longer than any other American food import, you observe how the plant's attractive foliage and colorful fruits make it popular in formal gardens, where visitors can admire its exotic beauty from a safe distance. This ornamental status would inadvertently help spread tomato plants throughout Europe, establishing their presence in regions that wouldn't consider eating them for generations to come. When confronted with tomatoes' superficial resemblance to known poisonous plants, caution represents the sensible approach. Without modern understanding of plant families and relationships, these early botanists rely on superficial similarities: leaf shape, growth habit, fruit appearance, leading to classifications that sometimes group harmless plants with genuinely dangerous ones. You encounter evidence for both positions. Botanical texts that specifically note physical similarities to poisonous European plants, but also writings that dismiss American foods broadly as suitable only for primitive peoples and not refined European constitutions. Cultural pride, botanical misunderstanding, and genuine safety concerns intertwine in ways that make isolating a single cause impossible, creating lasting associations that prove difficult to dispel. So, Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight, so drop your location and local time in the comments below. Or dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first European tomatoes likely looked quite different from modern varieties, smaller, more yellow than red, and considerably more bitter. You examine an early specimen that more closely resembles a modern cherry tomato than the large, sweet varieties we know today. These physical characteristics made classification even more challenging and contributed to regional differences in acceptance. Italian gardeners, for instance, seem to receive varieties that the nightshade newcomers, that would eventually become tomatoes, arrived in Europe following Columbus's voyages, entering a world utterly unprepared for their existence. The initial introduction proves especially confusing, because tomatoes arrive alongside a bewildering array of other American foods: potatoes, corn, peppers, and tobacco. You watch as European naturalists struggle to categorize these botanical strangers, attempting to fit them into existing knowledge systems that simply weren't designed to accommodate them. A Spanish naturalist named Monard compiles one of the earliest European descriptions of tomatoes in 1574, describing them as pommes d'amour for their supposed aphrodisiac properties, an early example of the contradictory reputations that would follow tomatoes for centuries. What's particularly fascinating about this initial encounter is that tomatoes weren't universally rejected. One mainstream historical fact that shaped tomato reception was the lack of botanical knowledge to accurately classify new plants. The language barriers compound this confusion, are unsafe to eat. A German text from 1586 warns against golden apples that cause madness and death, possibly conflating tomatoes with unrelated poisonous plants. A particularly quirky tidbit emerges when you investigate why early tomatoes received such contradictory reputations, or more immediately palatable, potentially explaining their earlier culinary adoption. The fear surrounding tomatoes wasn't entirely irrational. Historians still argue whether tomato rejection was primarily driven by legitimate botanical confusion or by cultural resistance to New World imports more generally. As the 16th century progresses, you witness the tomato developing a curious dual identity in European consciousness: decorative but dangerous. By 1600, the stage is set for centuries of tomato controversy. You're leafing through a botanical textbook in a 16th century European university, tracing your finger along intricate woodcut illustrations of plants in the Solanaceae family. The deadly family resemblance that would condemn tomatoes for generations jumps out from these pages. Where the innocent tomato plant is depicted alongside its genuinely toxic relatives, note the similar leaf structure, whispers the aging professor guiding your studies, pointing between illustrations of tomatoes and deadly nightshade. You re-examining how scientific understanding in the 16th and 17th centuries relied heavily on categorizing plants by their visible characteristics rather than chemical properties or genetic relationships. Tomatoes were quickly recognized as members of the nightshade family, which included several notorious European plants: deadly nightshade, mandrake, and black nightshade. You're re-attending a lecture where a physician describes deadly nightshade's effects in terrifying detail: dilated pupils, racing heartbeat, hallucinations, and eventually death. Some varieties were so toxic that merely handling the plants could cause symptoms if residue was transferred to the eyes or mouth. It's absolutely correct. Tomato foliage contains significant amounts of tomatine and solanine, compounds that can indeed cause illness. You're examining an influential 1597 herbal by John Gerard that explicitly warns against tomatoes, describing them as cold, moist, and potentially harmful while acknowledging their ornamental value. Similar warnings appeared in herbals and medical texts throughout Europe, the authors often copying each other's cautions without first-hand investigation. The great taxonomist Carl Linnaeus initially classified the tomato as Solanum lycopersicum in 1753, with lycopersicum deriving from Latin words meaning wolf peach, reflecting the long-standing belief that wolves use nightshade plants as poison. The fact that tomatoes later received their own genus before eventually returning to Solanum shows how even scientific understanding of this plant remained in flux for centuries. You're in a countryside garden where wild nightshade berries grow, not far from cultivated tomatoes, noting how certain varieties of unripe tomatoes could easily be confused with the toxic black nightshade berries that grew wild throughout Europe. In an era before standardized botanical education, this visual similarity represented a practical problem. How could ordinary people be expected to distinguish safe? This scientific name literally embedded the fear Gerard's widely. In these regions, the tomato S family resemblance provoked stronger and more persistent rejections than in areas where deadly nightshade was less common. This geographical pattern of fear followed the distribution of the tomato's most dangerous European relatives, creating regional variations in acceptance that would persist for generations. Without chemical analysis, genetic understanding, or controlled toxicology studies, the cautious approach of avoiding all nightshades for consumption represented prudent wisdom rather than a rational fear. You encounter contradictory evidence. Scholarly works clearly warning against tomato consumption, yet records of some educated individuals growing and consuming them without apparent concern. Even as some Mediterranean regions begin incorporating tomatoes into their cuisine, the Nightshade Association continues to cast a shadow over this American immigrant. The perception of danger, enforced by botanical classification, visual similarity to toxic plants, and the genuine toxicity of tomato leaves and stems creates a foundation of your using the identification methods. Available to 16th century Europeans examining leaf patterns, growth habits, flower structures, the disconnect suggests that formal warnings in botanical texts might have been repeated out of scholarly tradition rather than genuine conviction. While actual practices varied considerably depending on region and individual knowledge, this partial truth that portions of the tomato plant contain toxins made it easier to believe the fruits might be dangerous as well, especially when they remained green or partially ripened. Given such dangerous relatives, tomatoes' guilt by association seemed entirely reasonable to people lacking modern understanding of plant chemistry. This botanical connection was not just an academic classification, it carried life or death implications in a world where identifying safe foods often relied on. Nature often gives us such clues to a plant's character. The similarity is indeed striking. The same leaf pattern, similar flower structure, and a familiar growing habit that makes these botanical cousins appear almost interchangeable to the untrained eye. The tomato's unfortunate family tree represents one of history's most consequential cases of guilt by association, recognizing plant-family relationships. What makes this association particularly damning is that nightshade plants weren't just vaguely feared, they were among the most notorious poisons in European consciousness. One mainstream historical fact that reinforced this suspicion was the genuine toxicity present in tomato. plants themselves, just not in the ripe fruits. You're watching a gardener carefully remove tomato leaves and stems while preparing the garden for winter, explaining that livestock have been sickened by consuming these parts of the plant. The botanical texts of the period reflect this confusion. Reedwork classified tomatoes as golden apples or love apples, but advised against eating them. An opinion that carried significant weight, given his reputation as one of England's foremost plant experts. A particularly quirky tidbit emerges when you discover how the Nightshade Association influenced the tomato's scientific naming of tomatoes into its formal classification, creating an official-sounding justification for avoiding them. The visual similarity between tomato fruits and some genuinely dangerous berries further complicated matters. From unsafe when they appeared so similar, historians still argue whether educated Europeans truly believed mature tomatoes were deadly, or the Nightshade Association mainly affected popular perception rather than scientific opinion. The Nightshade Association created particularly strong fears in regions where deadly nightshade was common. You're traveling through Germany and England, where wild belladonna grew abundantly, and where stories of nightshade poisoning circulated regularly. What's most fascinating about this nightshade connection is how reasonable it seems when viewed through the lens of pre-modern botanical knowledge. And Plant Jussisand, finding that tomatoes indeed share numerous characteristics with plants known to be deadly. By the early 17th century, the tomato's deadly family resemblance has thoroughly tainted its reputation across much of Europe. Suspicion that will require centuries and multiple lines of evidence to fully overcome. You're attending a lavish banquet in an Italian nobleman's palazzo around 1560, where whispers circulate about the strange new pomodoro being served in a sauce over veal. The aristocratic plate poisonings that would soon become associated with tomatoes haven't yet entered popular consciousness. But you're witnessing the precise circumstances that would spawn one of history's most persistent food myths. The wealthy host proudly serves his exotic dish on gleaming pewter platters, unaware that this combination of serving vessel and food will soon create a deadly reputation that follows tomatoes for centuries. The connection between tomatoes and aristocratic poisonings represents one of history's most fascinating cases of correlation mistaken for causation. You're reliving through a period when unexplained deaths among nobility frequently spark rumors of poisoning and an unreasonable suspicion. In Renaissance courts where political assassination via tainted food was a legitimate concern, this tasteless and visible poison would accumulate in the bodies of aristocrats who regularly consumed acidic foods from pewter serviceware, eventually causing symptoms that 16th century medicine couldn't properly diagnose: fatigue, confusion, abdominal pain, headaches, and in severe cases, death. When wealthy individuals began dying after meals featuring the exotic new tomato, a causal relationship seemed obvious to contemporary observers. You're re-attending a medical lecture where a physician describes a strange malady affecting wealthy families: progressive weakness, confusion, joint pain, and eventual death, all symptoms we now recognize as chronic lead poisoning. Without knowledge of lead's toxicity or its interaction with acidic foods, physicians sought other explanations for you revisiting peasant homes where meals are served on wooden trenchers or simple ceramic dishes, materials that don't react with acidic foods. You find evidence for both possibilities. Court records mentioning suspicious deaths following banquets where new American foods were served, but also a notable absence of medical texts, specifically documenting tomato toxicity cases. This class-based explanation for differential outcomes protected the core belief in tomato toxicity while accounting for contradictory evidence, allowing the myth to persist despite growing instances of safe tomato consumption. You're visiting northern European courts where tomatoes remained primarily ornamental plants into the 17th century, excluded from cookery precisely when lead-containing pewter reached it in a strange way. The false belief in tomato toxicity provided partial protection against the very real toxicity of contemporary tableware. The combination of mysterious noble deaths, exotic new fruit, and invisible lead contamination created a perfect environment for misunderstanding. Even as some Mediterranean regions increasingly incorporated tomatoes into their cuisine, typically served on ceramic rather than pewter, the reputation for deadliness persisted elsewhere. To reinforce the truth likely involves a combination of real lead poisoning incidents, misattributed natural deaths, an evolving folklore that connected these narratives into a compelling story about dangerous foreign fruits. This class-based difference in outcomes reinforced the tomato's mysterious reputation. Deadly in palaces, but occasionally harmless in cottages for reasons nobody could explain. In these humble settings, few brave souls who experimented with tomatoes suffered no ill high quality. Pewter in this era typically contains significant amounts of lead, up to 30% in some cases, creating an invisible hazard on the dining tables of the wealthy. While relatively stable under most circumstances, this lead would react with certain acidic foods, leaching into meals and causing chronic lead poisoning among frequent users of such tableware. What these observers couldn't know was that the actual culprit wasn't the tomato itself, but its interaction with the dining vessels exclusive to the wealthy. You're watching kitchen servants prepare a tomato sauce, noting how they wince at its acidity when tasting for seasoning. This high acid content, which you're re-listening to a group of noble ladies discussing the supposedly instantaneous death of a count. After consuming tomatoes at a diplomatic dinner, the story has all the elements of compelling gossip: a prominent victim, an exotic suspect, and a dramatic demise, but bears little resemblance to the gradual onset of actual lead poisoning. These sensationalized accounts spread rapidly through aristocratic circles, reinforcing tomato fears among precisely the social class most vulnerable to the real culprit: lead tableware. One mainstream historical fact that fueled this misunderstanding was the common use of pewter tableware among European aristocracy. You're examining an elaborate pewter serving platter in a noble household, admiring its craftsmanship while being entirely unaware of its dangerous chemical composition. The tomato's chemistry made it particularly problematic when served on pewter. Gives tomatoes their bright flavor, eagerly dissolves lead from pewter dishes, creating lead acetate that contaminates the food. A particularly quirky tidbit emerges when you investigate how class divisions in tableware created corresponding differences in tomato perception, effects creating a curious situation where peasants could safely consume a food that appeared to poison aristocrats. The timing of tomato introduction unfortunately coincided with increased awareness of lead poisoning symptoms, though without understanding of its causes. These aristocratic ailments, with the exotic new tomato providing a convenient scapegoat. Specific incidents of apparent tomato poisoning spread through gossip networks, growing more dramatic with each retelling. Historians still argue whether any documented cases of tomato poisoning among nobility actually existed, or if the association developed through folklore rather than specific incidents. The pewter-tomato interaction created a particularly persistent myth because it contained elements of truth that made it resistant to counter-evidence. You're observing how reports of peasants safely eating tomatoes from wooden bowls do undispel aristocratic fears. The prevailing explanation simply evolves to suggest that refined noble constitutions are more sensitive to toxins than hardy peasant bodies. What's most ironic about this misunderstanding is how the tomato's perceived danger initially limited its spread, potentially saving lives by preventing wider exposure to lead poisoning. Peak popularity? Had tomatoes been immediately embraced throughout Europe, lead poisoning might have affected even more aristocratic households. By the mid-17th century, the association between tomatoes and aristocratic illness has become firmly established in European consciousness, particularly in northern regions where tomato culinary use remained limited. By genuine instances of illness that modern science would eventually trace to the plate rather than the produce, you're huddled in the cramped workroom of a 16th century botanist, peering over his shoulder as he struggles to classify the mysterious tomato plant according to ancient Galenic principles. Classification confusion surrounds this New World newcomer. European scientists attempt to squeeze it into taxonomic systems developed millennia before America's discovery. It grows like a nightshade, mutters the botanist, scratching notes with a quill, yet the Aztecs apparently eat it freely. Most perplexing, you're living through the awkward adolescence of botanical science, when ancient Greek and Roman texts still carry more authority than direct observation, yet new discoveries are increasingly challenging traditional categories. You re-attending a university lecture where Theophrastus and Pliny are quoted as definitive sources on plant properties despite these authors having died over 1,500 years earlier, long before any European contact with the Americas. When confronted with tomatoes, scholars instinctively search these ancient texts for similar plants, finding closest matches among plants now known to be toxic. The distinctive five-petaled flowers, alternating leaves, and internal seed structure of tomatoes do genuinely match those of several poisonous European plants. Without genetic analysis or modern understanding of plant chemistry, these visual similarities provided the most reliable classification method available, leading naturally to grouping tomatoes with their more dangerous relatives. You're sitting in on a scholarly argument between physicians with competing theories about what makes substances toxic. Tomatoes became a focal point in these debates precisely because of their ambiguous status, clearly related to known poisons, yet reportedly eaten safely in the Americas, making them perfect test cases for competing toxicological theories. You're examining his widely distributed 1544 herbal, where tomatoes are described as a type of Mala insana or Matapula category that included eggplants, good, but carried connotations of mental disturbance. Mattioli's somewhat ambiguous text could be interpreted as either endorsing or warning against tomato consumption, depending on how readers understood his classification. You encounter evidence supporting both interpretations. Careful botanical observations noting legitimate similarities between tomatoes and toxic plants, but also dismissive writings that rejected savage foods as categorically inferior to European staples. The truth likely combines both factors' scientific limitations, providing seemingly objective reasons to reinforce culturally driven suspicions of foreign foods. His immense influence meant that this ambiguity was reproduced across Europe. A botanist's cautious note about requiring further investigation before regular consumption might be cited by the next author as suspected to be unwholesome, then transformed in later texts too known to be poisonous. This citation cascade amplified initial classification uncertainty into seemingly authoritative declarations of danger, all while actual evidence remained scarce. Some advocate the ancient theory that poison represents an essential quality inherent in certain plants from creation, while others propose more modern ideas about dosage. This backward-looking approach to botanical knowledge created a classification system inherently biased against New World species that had no classical precedent. This regional divergence in scientific classification mirrors the emerging culinary divide. With tomatoes entering regular usage in Mediterranean cookery while remaining primarily ornamental elsewhere, the tomato's long journey toward universal acceptance has begun, but classification confusion will continue hampering its progress for generations to come, creating one of history's most persistent cases of mistaken vegetable identity. You're reviewing botanical texts from different European countries, noticing how the tomato accumulated a bewildering array of names. Pomodoro Golden scholars trained in medieval approaches to plant classification find themselves utterly unprepared for the flood of New World species that refuse to fit neatly into Dioscorides' ancient plant categories or Galen's system of qualities and humors. You're re-observing a heated debate between scholars arguing whether tomatoes should be classified as fruits or vegetables, distinction carrying significant implications for how they would be prepared and consumed if deemed edible. Some classified tomatoes as fruits based on their seed-bearing structure, placing them in categories associated with desserts and raw consumption. Others emphasize their culinary use alongside other savory plants, arguing for vegetable classification. This seemingly academic dispute had practical consequences, as different culinary treatments could affect whether tomatoes were prepared in ways that maximized or minimized any actual risks in mala and sana. In some medical texts, this naming chaos reflected underlying classification uncertainty while creating practical problems. Scholars from different regions often failed to recognize they were discussing the same plant, leading to contradictory claims about tomato properties being circulated simultaneously in different languages. You watch him vacillate between categories, ultimately deciding to err on the side of caution by listing the tomato among plants suspected of poisonous properties requiring further investigation, a designation that will shadow this fruit for generations. The tomato encountered Europe during a period of profound transition in scientific understanding, creating a perfect storm of classification confusion. One mainstream historical fact that severely hampered accurate tomato classification was the rigid adherence to classical authorities. The physical characteristics of tomatoes created genuine classification challenges. You're examining an early botanical illustration showing tomatoes alongside other Solanaceae family members, noting the legitimate similarities that confused early observers. A particularly quirky tidbit emerges when you investigate how linguistic confusion compounded scientific misclassification. Apple in Italy, love apple in England, wolf peach in parts of Germany. The classification of tomatoes became entangled with European debates about the entire concept of poison, an individual sensitivity determining toxicity. The influential botanical work of Pietro Andrea Mattioli further muddied the waters. As later botanists referenced his work, perpetuating classification uncertainty for decades, historians still argue whether tomato misclassification stemmed primarily from genuine scientific confusion or from cultural resistance to Native American foodways. The classification challenges extended beyond simple poison or not poison binaries into more complex questions about the tomato's fundamental nature. The classification confusion surrounding tomatoes created a self-reinforcing cycle of uncertainty. You rewatching how tentative warnings in early botanical texts often, simply acknowledging insufficient information rather than declaring definite danger, get progressively distorted through subsequent citations. By the late 17th century, tomato classification remains inconsistent across Europe, with regional variations creating a patchwork of acceptance and rejection. You're traveling between countries, discovering how Italian botanical texts increasingly classify tomatoes as edible fruits, while Northern European sources maintain more suspicious categorizations. You're sitting in a physician's chamber in 1580, listening as he explains the delicate balance of bodily humors that supposedly govern your health. Humoral theory mischief stands at the center of tomato rejection, as this ancient medical framework provides seemingly scientific justification for avoiding the suspicious American fruit. The tomato, he pronounces with authority while examining a specimen, possesses cold. You, re-examining a physician's diagnostic chart, showing how these qualities combine to create the four humors: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. Good health supposedly depended on maintaining proper balance among these humors, with diet playing a crucial role in restoration when imbalances occurred. You're watching a physician demonstrate how tomatoes' high water content, cool pulp, and acidic juice all pointed toward cold and moist classification. These observable properties fit neatly within existing humoral frameworks, creating a classification that seems scientifically validated through direct sensory evidence rather than mere speculation. Notice how the juice feels cool upon the skin, he explains, squeezing a tomato onto his wrist, and how it... Within this system, every food required careful classification to determine its effect on the body's humoral equilibrium, and moist qualities in the extreme, which would dangerously unbalance the humors, particularly in melancholic individuals. You're in a garden with a physic practitioner, who explains that green tomatoes were considered extremely cold and potentially dangerous to all constitutions, while fully ripened specimens were thought to become slightly warmer in nature, though still problematically moist. You're traveling between medical schools, discovering how physicians in warmer Mediterranean climates were more accepting of cold foods as beneficial counterbalances to hot environments and temperaments. You find evidence supporting both interpretations, detailed analyses that seem to show genuine concern about humoral implications, but also suspicious inconsistencies in how rigidly humoral logic was applied to tomatoes compared to other new foods. You're in an Italian kitchen around 1650, watching a cook demonstrate how tomatoes could be made safer by combining them with warming ingredients like olive oil, garlic, and hot spices that would counteract their cold nature. The heat of the oil and garlic balances the cold of the tomato, she explains while preparing an early version of tomato sauce, making the combination safe, even for those who could not tolerate the fruit alone. This humoral balancing act created pathways for tomato acceptance in Mediterranean cooking long before Northern Europeans would consider similar uses. Their cooling nature makes them appropriate only in small quantities, primarily in summer months, and always prepared with warming herbs. This gradual relaxation of humoral restrictions parallels tomatoes' increasing culinary acceptance, creating a convenient framework that allows both traditional and progressive physicians to sanctify. Changing food practices without admitting earlier medical advice was fundamentally flawed. The tomato's perceived coldness may have provided a convenient scientific sounding justification for avoiding a plant already suspected for other reasons, allowing physicians to maintain professional authority while reinforcing popular caution. In southern Spain and Italy, tomatoes' cooling properties gradually became seen as potentially beneficial during summer months or for individuals with naturally hot constitutions. Meanwhile, physicians in cooler northern regions continued warning against tomatoes' cold nature, considering them particularly inappropriate for the already cool constitutions typical of this ripeness. Distinction created practical confusion about when tomatoes might be used. Nod solemnly. Having no reason to question this assessment based on medical theories that have dominated European thought for over 1,000 years, even if not actively poisonous, as some now argue, the lecturer concedes. Their extreme cold and moist qualities make them unsuitable as regular nourishment for most constitutions. This continuing humoral suspicion helps explain why tomato acceptance proceeded. Gradually, even after direct poisoning fears began subsiding, the fruit remained. Suspect even when no longer considered actively dangerous. You re-listening to a midwife explain why pregnant women especially should avoid tomatoes? The child in the womb requires warmth for proper formation, while cold foods like these love apples would endanger development and could cause miscarriage. Similar warnings extended to the elderly, scholars, and anyone suffering from cold diseases like rheumatism or respiratory ailments. These population-specific warnings meant that even in regions where some tomato consumption occurred, significant segments of society continued avoiding them on humoral. You're reviewing a medical text that warns against foods with these properties, explaining how they supposedly promote excess phlegm production, slow digestion, and dampen the vital heat necessary for good health. Within humoral logic, cold and moist foods were to be limited even when recognized as non-poisonous, making tomatoes doubly suspicious, potentially toxic due to their nightshade connection, and humorally imbalancing regardless. The humoral theory of medicine, inherited from ancient Greek and Roman physicians, created a comprehensive framework that categorized everything foods, bodies, seasons, even personalities, according to 4 fundamental qualities: hot, cold, wet, and dry. One mainstream historical fact that significantly impacted tomato reception was its unfortunate classification as cold and moist. The same qualities associated with phlegm and considered particularly problematic. The sensory characteristics of tomatoes seem to confirm their problematic humoral properties. Maintains coolness, unlike hot-natured fruits that warm quickly to the touch. A particularly quirky tidbit emerges when you investigate how tomatoes receive different humoral classifications depending on their ripeness. Safely consumed, with some authorities insisting that even perfectly ripe specimens remained dangerously cold in quality. Regional variations in humoral application created inconsistent tomato assessments across Europe. Northern Europeans, the humoral framework created particular concern about tomatoes for certain population groups, grounds. Historians still argue whether physicians genuinely believed tomatoes were humorally dangerous, or if these classifications were retrofitted to justify existing suspicions based on the nightshade connection. Attempts to correct tomatoes' humoral imbalance through preparation methods created some of the earliest acceptable uses. The persistence of humoral thinking extended tomato suspicion well beyond the point when actual poisoning fears began fading. You're attending a medical lecture in the early 18th century, nearly 200 years after tomatoes' European introduction, where physicians still caution against excessive consumption based purely on humoral concerns rather than toxicity. By the late 18th century, humoral theory faces increasing scientific challenges, yet continues influencing popular understanding of tomatoes. You're examining a household medical guide from 1790 that contains this curious hybrid of old and new thinking. While modern chemistry suggests tomatoes contain no actual poison, you're sitting by a cottage hearth as darkness falls over the English countryside in 1650. Listening to an elderly villager share tales of the mysterious love apple plant growing in the local manor-esque garden, folklore and superstition spread has transformed tomatoes from mere botanical curiosities into objects of supernatural suspicion. The red fruit draws witches, the old woman whispers in German villages. Tomatoes are rumored to attract werewolves during full moons due to their blood-red color. French peasants in some regions believe the plants whisper at night, supposedly repeating conversations held near them during daylight hours. English folklore connects tomatoes to fairies, claiming the fruits serve as disguised fairy dwellings that should never be brought indoors after sunset. You re-examining a collection of rural beliefs documenting how love apples supposedly functioned as aphrodisiacs or featured in love magic. These associations likely stemmed from the fruit's red color and juicy texture, combined with its early Italian name pomodoro being misinterpreted and transformed in translation to love apple in English and similar terms in other languages. Young women in certain Italian villages reportedly placed tomatoes under their pillows to dream of future husbands, while in parts of France, a gift of tomatoes you're shown a peculiar rural practice where tomato plants were sometimes planted atop graves, based on the belief that they could prevent the dead from rising by absorbing spiritual disturbances from the soil. This practice appears to have transferred from earlier mandrake folklore, likely due to both plants belonging to the nightshade family and sharing certain visual characteristics. You're re-reviewing court records from witch trials where growing unusual plants, especially those with suspected magical properties, sometimes featured among accusations. You're comparing superstitions across Europe, noting how Mediterranean regions developed more benign or even positive tomato beliefs, while northern areas favored more sinister interpretations. In Sicily, folklore suggested tomatoes could ward off evil eye when hung dried above doorways, while German superstitions warned that tomato plants attracted lightning strikes and should never be grown near homes. You'll find evidence supporting both possibilities. Seemingly organic folklore variations that follow typical development patterns, but also suspiciously similar warnings repeated across distant regions, suggesting possible institutional dissemination. Church sermons occasionally referenced foreign fruits as potential temptations or dangers, potentially reinforcing supernatural suspicions while maintaining plausible deniability about specific plants. These regional differences paralleled culinary acceptance patterns, with areas more familiar with tomatoes as food generally developing less threatening folklore. You re-witnessing how a summer illness affecting several children in a village becomes attributed to tomato influence, after someone recalls the children playing near this confirmation bias helped tomato. Superstitions persist despite increasing evidence of safe consumption in some regions. You re-observing how even as urban physicians increasingly question tomato toxicity and sophisticated cooks experiment with tomato recipes. Rural communities maintain supernatural suspicions that delay adoption. You're listening to descriptions of belladonna poisoning, dilated. Pupils creating light when similar symptoms occasionally occurred following consumption of unripe tomatoes or tomato leaves. These experiences reinforced beliefs in the plant's magical properties. Genuine physiological reactions became documented as spiritual or supernatural encounters, creating seemingly credible evidence for tomato folklore. Long after their safety had been scientifically established and their culinary value widely recognized, cultivating tomatoes could arouse suspicion in communities already primed to look for evidence of diabolical influence, especially given the plant's foreign origin and striking appearance. One account from 1621 mentions a woman accused of witchcraft partly because she grew strange red fruits from the Indies in a private garden, her face illuminated by firelight. Lady Hampton's scullery maid swears she saw figures dancing among the plants at midnight last summer solstice. You feel a chill despite the fire's warmth. Witnessing how ordinary plants become embedded in extraordinary beliefs when scientific understanding fails to fill the knowledge void. The supernatural dimensions of tomato fear represent a fascinating case study in how folklore rapidly attaches to unfamiliar objects. You're traveling through rural communities across Europe, discovering an astonishing variety of superstitions that have developed around tomatoes in just a century since their introduction. One mainstream historical fact that facilitated these superstitions was the tomato's initial status as an ornamental rather than edible plant. You're visiting a wealthy estate where tomatoes grow alongside purely decorative flowers, creating ambiguity about their purpose. Their ornamental status meant people observed them regularly without interacting with them as food, creating the perfect conditions for observation without familiarity. That proves fertile ground for supernatural speculation. Plants without clear utilitarian value often attracted magical associations in pre-industrial societies, and tomatoes with their vibrant color and initially uncertain purpose practically invited folkloric embellishment. The tomato's connection to love and sexuality in folklore proved particularly persistent. A man to a woman was interpreted as a declaration of romantic intentions. A particularly quirky tidbit emerges when you investigate how tomato folklore intertwined with existing beliefs about mandrake roots. Confusion created hybrid superstitions where beliefs previously attached to European nightshades transferred to their American cousin, creating an instant folklore heritage for the newcomer plant. The timing of tomato introduction coincided with Europe's witch trial period, creating particularly dangerous associations. Almost certainly tomatoes and allegedly used them in unspecified, unwholesome preparations. Regional variations in tomato folklore reflected broader cultural patterns. Historians still argue whether tomato superstitions primarily spread through genuine folk belief or were, sometimes deliberately encouraged by authorities to discourage consumption of suspected poisonous plants. The physical symptoms of actual nightshade poisoning contributed to supernatural interpretations. Sensitivity, hallucinations, confusion, and delirium, which early modern observers often interpreted through supernatural frameworks rather than toxicological understanding. Tomato superstitions created self-reinforcing belief cycles through selective interpretation of coincidences. A tomato plant days earlier, once established, such associations become impossible to disprove. Every misfortune occurring after tomato exposure reinforces the connection, while uneventful exposures are simply not remarked upon. By the early 18th century, tomato folklore has become deeply embedded in European rural consciousness, creating cultural barriers to acceptance that operate independently from scientific or culinary considerations. folkloric associations prove remarkably durable. With vestiges surviving into modern times, you might be surprised to learn that even in the early 20th century, isolated communities maintained residual superstitions about tomatoes. You're aboard a Spanish galleon in 1573, watching as sailors carefully pack crates of dried botanical specimens for the journey back to Europe. Colonial misinterpretations concerning New World foods have already begun, creating layers of confusion that will follow tomatoes across the Atlantic. The ship's naturalist shows you his notes on the zytomatal plant, struggling to transcribe Nahuatl pronunciation into Spanish characters. You're observing the multi-stage journey of information. Native Americans describing plants to Spanish explorers, who record impressions in field journals, which are then summarized in reports to colonial authorities, who forward selected details to European universities. We're scholars. The natives eat these freely, he explains, though I cannot determine if they consume them raw or only after cooking. My interpreter was rather unclear on this point. At each stage, crucial context gets lost: preparation methods, growing conditions, variety distinctions. Seasonal usage leaving European recipients with decontextualized facts that prove dangerously misleading. The Nahuatl word tomatel originally referred to several round fruits, including tomatillos and true tomatoes, creating fundamental confusion about which plant various reports described. This linguistic overlap meant that safety information about one plant was frequently misapplied to the other. With tomatillo preparation, this seemingly minor ambiguity about preparation methods will spawn centuries of conflicting information once these notes reach European scholars. The process of knowledge transfer between continents created perfect conditions for misunderstanding. These economic assessments often contain selective or exaggerated information designed to either promote or discourage particular crops based on commercial interest rather than botanical accuracy. Crops competing with established European products sometimes received suspiciously negative assessments, while plants offering novel commercial opportunities garnered more positive descriptions. Tomatoes offering no obvious economic advantage over existing European fruits in early assessments received relatively little attention in commercial reports, leaving academic and medical sources as the re-examining a Spanish explorer's notes describing his dismay upon seeing Aztec nobles consuming raw tomatoes at a feast. Though these Indians eat the red fruits without apparent harm, their constitution must differ greatly from our own, for they consume many substances known to be unwholesome to European bodies. You find evidence supporting both positions: detailed documentation of linguistic confusion and translation difficulties, but also clear instances where accurate indigenous information was dismissed specifically because of its source. You're reading missionary accounts that sometimes interpreted indigenous food practices through theological lenses, particularly when plants had ceremonial or spiritual significance to native populations. When tomatoes appeared in indigenous religious contexts, whether as offerings, ritual items, or associated with particular deities, this information sometimes prompted European religious suspicion that transferred to the plants themselves. While tomatoes had less ceremonial significance than crops like corn or cacao, their occasional appearance in religious contexts created additional layers of colonial misinterpretation. The reality likely combined innocent misunderstandings with systemic biases that privileged European frameworks over indigenous knowledge. creating information transfer patterns that consistently erred toward caution rather than acceptance. You're tracking how Portuguese, Spanish, French, and English colonial reports reached Europe at different times, often containing conflicting assessments based on encounters with different tomato varieties in different regions. You're reviewing a 1615 botanical compilation that attempts to reconcile these contradictory colonial reports, including with magnificent understatement. Authorities disagree on the proper use of this American fruit, with some reporting regular consumption without harm, while others warning of potential dangers depending on preparation and individual constitution. This tentative summary, neither fully endorsing nor condemning tomatoes, reflects the fundamental uncertainty created by colonial misinterpretations, establishing a pattern of ambivalence that would characterize European tomato attitudes for generations to come. Spanish reports from Mexico describing regular tomato consumption arrived decades before English reports from North American colonies, where some native groups apparently used tomatoes more cautiously. These chronological and geographical inconsistencies created a fragmented European understanding that seemed to confirm the tomato's unpredictable nature. You're reviewing correspondence between colonial administrators and European universities, noting how information from native sources was systematically devalued compared to observations by European-trained individuals. When indigenous healers described tomato medicinal uses, these applications were often recorded as primitive superstitions rather than practical knowledge. Conversely, European visitors' speculations about tomato properties received disproportionate weight despite their limited experience with the plant. This epistemic injustice meant that generations of practical indigenous knowledge about tomato varieties, preparation, and usage were effectively filtered out of European understanding. This assumption that Native Americans possessed fundamentally different physiological tolerances allowed Europeans to acknowledge indigenous tomato consumption, while still maintaining beliefs about the fruit's danger to European constitutions. Attempt to reconcile this fragmented information with existing botanical frameworks. One mainstream historical fact that exacerbated these misinterpretations was the significant diversity within tomato varieties encountered by different explorers. You're comparing specimens brought back from various regions of the Americas, noting substantial differences in size, color, and acidity. Some explorers encountered small yellow tomatoes that local populations ate raw, while others observed larger, or acidic varieties that were always cooked before consumption. Without understanding these varietal differences, Europeans received contradictory reports about tomato edibility that seemed to confirm their suspicions about the plant's unpredictable nature. Language barriers created particularly persistent misunderstandings. You're reviewing early colonial documents where Spanish explorers attempt to document Native American explanations of tomato usage, creating translations riddled with ambiguities, requirements sometimes incorrectly transferred to tomatoes. A particularly quirky tidbit emerges when you investigate how European preconceptions shaped colonial reporting. The context of colonial power dynamics influenced how indigenous knowledge was valued and transmitted. Colonial economic considerations further complicated accurate information transfer. You're examining reports from plantation developers evaluating which New World crops might prove profitable in European markets. Primary information channels, sources already predisposed toward caution. Historians still argue whether colonial misinterpretations stemmed primarily from genuine communication challenges or from deliberate filtering of information to maintain European cultural superiority. The timing of information arrival created particular confusion as different colonial powers reported contradictory tomato information. Religious dimensions of colonial encountering further complicated tomato information. By the early 17th century, European understanding of tomatoes had become a complex patchwork of accurate observations, mistranslations, cultural biases, and commercial agendas, all filtered through multiple stages of information transfer. You're standing among a curious crowd gathered in an Italian market square in 1615, watching a flamboyantly dressed man dramatically consume a raw tomato before astonished onlookers. As the first brave eaters, who publicly challenged tomato fears, represent an important chapter in rehabilitating this suspected fruit. "I've eaten these poison apples daily for 3 years," the performer announces after swallowing, "and as you see, I remain in perfect health." The demonstration draws gasps and skeptical murmurs. Some spectators suspect trickery. Others wonder if he possesses some special immunity. You're re-attending a lecture by a progressive physician who emphasizes direct observation over ancient authorities. Galen never encountered American plants, so his writings cannot be considered definitive on their properties. We must instead rely on careful observation and experimentation. This philosophical shift created intellectual space for brave eaters to challenge traditional assumptions through practical demonstration rather than textual debate. In some areas, aristocratic garden enthusiasts let adoption their privileged position, providing some protection from criticism, while their trend-setting status helped normalize the practice. You're reading about Pietro Casella, flamboyant 17th century Italian physician who styled himself the tomato doctor, claiming the fruits cured his chronic digestive complaints and preserved his notably youthful appearance despite advanced age, wearing distinctive red clothing to reinforce his tomato association. Casella cultivated celebrity through public tomato-eating performances and enthusiastic testimonials. You rewatching a cautious but curious noblewoman try her first tomato after elaborate preparations. She selects only perfectly ripe specimens, removes all seeds and gel, boils the flesh thoroughly, seasons it heavily with protective herbs like basil and oregano, and consumes only a small portion with a large meal. You're reviewing reports about Spanish and Portuguese sailors who adopted tomatoes earlier than most Europeans, discovering how they valued the fruit's relatively long storage life and high vitamin C content. Maritime records documenting provisioning requests specifically for tomatoes created paper trails proving decades of regular consumption without reported poisonings. You encounter evidence supporting both narratives. Some early adopters display genuine uncertainty in their writings, describing careful self-experimentation with small quantities, while others confidently consume tomatoes without apparent concern, suggesting prior knowledge of their safety from immigrant communities or correspondence with colonists. The truth likely varied by individuals. Some performed genuine self-experimentation, while others capitalized on existing knowledge to create dramatically brave demonstrations for social impact. Similarly, hospital records from Italian institutions that began incorporating tomatoes into patient meals in the mid-17th century showed no negative outcomes, gradually establishing institutional confidence in their safety. You re-reviewing a physician's journal from 1720 that notes with scientific interest, despite thousands now consuming these fruits regularly in southern regions, medical literature documents no verified cases of resulting illness when properly ripened specimens are selected. This absence of evidence gradually transformed into evidence of absence regarding toxicity, creating an epidemiological argument that proved more convincing to medical authorities than individual demonstrations, however dramatic.
While simultaneously in London,
The first restaurants offering tomato dishes still advertised them as exotic curiosities for adventurous diners. The legacy of these first brave eaters varies by region, but their cumulative impact gradually undermined centuries of tomato suspicion, placing theoretical fears with practical experience that ultimately proved more persuasive than any scholarly argument could have been. Each year without documented poisonings, despite increasing consumption, made traditional warnings harder to maintain, particularly among empirically minded practitioners. These multifaceted precautions allowed hesitant individuals to experiment with tomatoes, while maintaining psychological safety nets. One particularly entrepreneurial Italian gardener, in 1680, offered a substantial cash reward to anyone who could prove illness, resulting from consuming his tomatoes, a challenge that generated significant publicity when no one successfully claimed the prize. These commercial promoters helped normalize tomato consumption by creating opportunities for hesitant individuals to observe or attempt tomato eating in controlled contexts. As no ill effects materialized, these cautions gradually relaxed, with each successful consumption experience building confidence for less restricted future use. While modern historians questioned some of his more extravagant claims, his theatrical approach undeniably brought attention to tomato edibility, creating memorable demonstrations that spread through popular anecdotes. Elsewhere, peasants with limited food options or immigrants from tomato-accepting regions became the first regular consumers, though their influence spread more slowly beyond their immediate communities. Most effective were respected middle-class figures like physicians, botanists, and prominent merchants. Public tomato consumption carried both social influence and perceived rational authority. When people visibly consumed tomatoes without ill effects, empirical evidence began outweighing theoretical concerns, at least among scientifically minded observers. But a few looked thoughtfully at the tomatoes displayed in nearby market stalls, perhaps reconsidering their own assumptions. Public tomato eating demonstrations emerged as a fascinating form of early and modern performance art. You're collecting accounts of these events across different European regions, discovering how they ranged from carnival-like spectacles to serious scientific demonstrations. In Naples, traveling performers incorporated tomato consumption into theatrical shows, dramatically pretending to die after eating the poisoned fruit before, miraculously recovering, simultaneously playing to and subtly undermining popular fears. More scholarly demonstrations occurred at botanical gardens and medical schools, where professors would taste small tomato samples while students monitored them for symptoms, creating documented cases of harmless consumption that gradually entered scientific literature. One mainstream historical fact that facilitated early tomato adoption was the increasing influence of Renaissance empiricism on medical and botanical thinking. The social status of early tomato adopters significantly influenced their impact on public perception. You're examining records of who first publicly embraced tomatoes in different regions, noticing patterns across social classes. A particularly quirky tidbit emerges when you investigate how some early tomato advocates deliberately cultivated dramatic personas to amplify their influence. The methods used by early adopters to minimize perceived risks reveal fascinating risk management strategies. Documentation of regular tomato consumption by specific populations provided particularly compelling evidence for safety. Historians still argue whether the first brave tomato eaters were genuinely risking their health or were already confident in the fruit's safety based on imported knowledge. Economic incentives sometimes motivated public tomato advocacy. You're examining records from early commercial tomato growers in southern Europe who faced significant marketing challenges. Given prevailing suspicions, some sponsored public eating demonstrations, or distributed free samples with cooking instructions, functioning essentially as early agricultural marketers, the gradual accumulation of uneventful tomato consumption eventually reached a tipping point, where absence of negative outcomes became its own powerful argument. By the early 18th century, public tomato consumption has transitioned from daring spectacle to unremarkable practice in Mediterranean regions, though suspicions linger elsewhere. You're visiting Naples, where street vendors openly sell fresh tomatoes to customers who display no hesitation. You're traveling across Europe in the early 1700s, mapping the curious geographical divisions in tomato acceptance that have emerged after nearly 2 centuries of European exposure to this American fruit. Regional acceptance variations present a fascinating patchwork across the continent, with some areas enthusiastically embracing tomatoes, while others maintain stubborn suspicion. In a Neapolitan kitchen, you watch a cook confidently prepare a rich tomato sauce for pasta, handling the bright red fruits with casual familiarity. Just weeks later, in a London market, you observe shoppers eyeing the same plant with suspicious glances, the vendor defensively insisting they're purely ornamental specimens, not for consumption. The Mediterranean northern divide in tomato acceptance represents one of history's most striking examples of regional food adoption patterns. You're comparing cookbooks from different European countries. It's published between 1650, discovering a clear culinary border. Spanish, Southern Italian, and Southern French texts increasingly include tomato recipes, while Northern European cookbooks maintain conspicuous silence regarding culinary applications. This division creates what food historians later call the tomato line, a culinary cultural boundary roughly corresponding to climate zones where tomatoes could be. Is Lee grown outdoors versus regions requiring more protected cultivation? One mainstream historical fact that significantly influenced these regional variations was the dramatic difference in tomato growing conditions across Europe. You're visiting agricultural regions, observing how tomatoes flourish in Mediterranean climates with long, hot summers, producing abundant harvests of naturally sweet, fully ripened fruits. In contrast, Northern European attempts at tomato cultivation often yield smaller crops of more acidic, sometimes partially ripened specimens due to shorter growing seasons and less reliable sunshine. These agricultural realities created fundamentally different experiences with tomatoes. Southern regions encountered them at their most appealing, while northern areas often saw them at their least impressive, reinforcing regional biases through genuinely different product quality. Climate-based cultivation differences affected more than just availability, they influenced the varieties that became established in different regions. You're examining tomato types grown across Europe, noting how Mediterranean areas quickly developed larger, sweeter varieties, suited to their growing conditions, while northern regions initially received smaller, more acidic types that could mature in shorter seasons. These varietal differences meant that even when northerners attempted to replicate southern tomato dishes, they often worked with fundamentally different ingredients, creating disappointing results that reinforced regional preferences. Only later development of cold-tolerant, earlier ripening varieties would begin bridging this quality gap. A particularly quirky tidbit emerges when you investigate how preservation methods shaped regional acceptance patterns. You're revisiting a Sicilian kitchen where cooks demonstrate an early version of sun-dried, tomatoes preserving summer abundance for year-round use by drying sliced tomatoes on rooftops. This preservation technique, well suited to Mediterranean climates, created delicious concentrated tomato flavors while solving storage problems. Northern Europeans, unable to reliably sun-dry tomatoes in their damper climates, lacked this preservation option, limiting tomatoes to fresh seasonal use, if grown at all. These practical preservation differences meant southern regions could incorporate tomatoes into their year-round culinary traditions, while northern areas viewed them as impractical, seasonal curiosities. The influence of influential local chefs and cookbook authors created self-reinforcing regional patterns. You re-examining how Antonio Latina's Spanish-influenced cookbook Los Scalco a la Moderna included several tomato recipes, creating a prestigious culinary endorsement that accelerated Italian acceptance. Similar influential cookbook authors in France and England either ignored tomatoes entirely or mentioned them only as curiosities, creating a culinary authority gap that reinforced existing regional biases. Home cooks naturally look to respected culinary voices when considering unfamiliar ingredients, making these early cookbook inclusions or exclusions disproportionately influential in shaping regional attitudes. Trade patterns and colonial connections further amplified regional differences. You're studying how Spain and Portugal maintained more direct trade with their American colonies, creating more frequent exposure to tomatoes and their culinary applications through returning sailors, colonial administrators, and imported goods. Northern European countries with fewer direct American colonial ties received tomato exposure primarily through Mediterranean intermediaries, adding additional layers of information, filtering, and cultural translation. These colonial connection differences meant Southern European countries received more consistent, first-hand information about tomato usage, while northern regions relied more heavily on second-hand accounts already shaped by Mediterranean interpretations. Historians still argue whether tomato acceptance variations stemmed primarily from practical agricultural factors or from deeper cultural differences in food innovation attitudes. You encounter evidence supporting both positions. Clear documentation of climate-based cultivation challenges in northern regions, but also writings suggesting philosophical differences in approaching novel foods. Mediterranean cultures displaying more openness to culinary innovation, while Northern European food traditions emphasize stability and continuity. The truth likely combines both practical and cultural factors, with agricultural realities creating initial regional differences that cultural attitudes subsequently reinforced and institutionalized. Religious and cultural perspectives on pleasure and sensuality subtly influenced regional tomato reception. You're analyzing how predominantly Catholic southern regions maintained more positive attitudes toward culinary pleasure and sensory enjoyment, while Protestant northern areas often approached food more functionally, emphasizing nutrition and moderation over flavor innovation. These philosophical differences affected willingness to experiment with new ingredients primarily valued for flavor contribution rather than caloric content. Tomatoes offering vibrant flavor but relatively low nutritional density compared to staple crops naturally found earlier acceptance in cultures that prioritize taste alongside sustenance. Economic factors created additional regional acceptance variations, particularly through class-based access differences. You re-examining how southern regions' favorable growing conditions made tomatoes relatively affordable and accessible across social classes, while northern cultivation challenges restricted them to wealthy households with specialized growing facilities. This accessibility difference meant Mediterranean tomato acceptance spread simultaneously through multiple social classes, creating broader cultural integration, while northern acceptance remained primarily elite and ornamental for generations. The tomato-esque contrasting social positions, everyday ingredient versus luxury curiosity, further reinforced divergent regional attitudes that would persist well into the 19th century. By 1750, these regional acceptance variations have created distinctly different tomato relationships across Europe. With integration nearly complete in parts of the Mediterranean, while significant suspicion lingers in northern regions. You're comparing contemporary accounts from travelers crossing these culinary borders, noting their surprise at the contrasting attitudes. Southern visitors to England express astonishment at continuing tomato fears, while English travelers to Italy marvel at casual tomato consumption among all social classes. These regional variations would gradually diminish through increasing communication, trade, and improved cultivation techniques. But vestiges of these differences would remain visible in regional cuisine emphases, even into modern times, a lasting legacy of how differently Europeans first encountered and interpreted this American botanical immigrant. You're peering through the doorway of an apothecary's workshop in 1630, watching with fascination as he carefully prepares a tomato-based remedy for a waiting customer. Medicinal contradictions surrounding tomatoes represent one of history's most peculiar paradoxes. As the very same fruit deemed poisonous by many Europeans simultaneously developed reputations for healing various ailments. For your daughter's fever, the herbalist explains, while crushing dried tomatoes into a fine powder, take 1 spoonful mixed with honey each morning. The patient nods gratefully, apparently unconcerned about consuming a plant widely considered dangerous, striking an example of how medicinal applications sometimes bypass culinary suspicions. The simultaneous existence of poison, fears, and medicinal uses created fascinating cognitive dissonance in European tomato understanding. You're examining medical texts from the 16th and 17th centuries, discovering treatments recommending tomatoes for conditions ranging from digestive complaints to skin diseases, often in the same volumes, that warn against consuming them as food. This apparent contradiction makes more sense when viewed through period medical philosophy, which frequently employed the paradoxical concept of controlled danger, the belief that substances with harmful properties could, when properly prepared and dosed, become effective medicines precisely because of their powerful effects on the body. One mainstream historical fact that facilitated medicinal tomato use was the long-standing tradition of using nightshade plants in European medicine. You're reviewing pharmacopoeia entries for deadly nightshade, henbane, and mandrake recognized as dangerous yet valued for specific medicinal applications when carefully processed and administered. Physicians familiar with these traditional nightshade remedies naturally investigated their American cousin for similar properties, creating a ready-made conceptual framework for tomato medicinal applications despite concerns about its safety as food. This pharmacological connection helps explain why tomatoes entered European medicine more readily than European cuisine in many regions. The perceived humoral properties of tomatoes created specific medicinal applications based on their cooling nature. You re-attending a medical lecture where a physician explains how tomato preparations could, counteract hot conditions like inflammatory fevers, skin eruptions, liver complaint ailments, believed to stem from excess heat in the body. The tomato's cold nature, he explains, while displaying dried specimens, makes it particularly effective against disorders of excessive heat, though this same quality renders it dangerous as regular nourishment. This humoral framing allowed tomatoes to be simultaneously dangerous generally, yet beneficial specifically, resolving the apparent contradiction through context-dependent properties. A particularly quirky tidbit emerges when you investigate how preparation methods distinguished medicinal from culinary tomato uses. You're watching an apothecary demonstrate elaborate processing techniques for medicinal tomato preparations, specific harvesting times, extraction methods using alcohol or vinegar rather than water, precise drying temperatures, and often combination with corrective ingredients believed to neutralize dangerous aspects while preserving therapeutic properties. These specialized preparations created conceptual separation between dangerous, raw tomatoes and transformed medicinal derivatives, allowing people to rationalize using tomato medicines while avoiding tomato foods. Regional variations in tomato medicinal applications reflected broader patterns of tomato acceptance. You're comparing medical manuscripts from different European countries, discovering that Mediterranean regions developed more extensive and varied tomato remedies earlier, while northern areas initially approached medicinal applications more cautiously. Italian physicians pioneered external tomato preparations like poultices for skin inflammation and arthritis before advancing to internal remedies.
Yes.
Creating a graduated adoption pattern that paralleled their earlier culinary acceptance. This regional variation suggests medical tomato uses followed rather than preceded general cultural familiarity. With areas already comfortable with tomatoes more readily exploring their medicinal potential, the ambiguous status of tomatoes created jurisdictional questions about who could legitimately prescribe them. You re-witnessing a heated argument between a university-trained physician and a folk healer over tomato preparations, the physician claiming such nightshade derivatives should only be administered by those with classical medical training, while the healer cites generations of practical experience with similar plants. This professional boundary dispute reveals how tomatoes occupied a contested middle ground between formal and informal medicine, simultaneously appearing in official pharmacopoeias and folk remedy collections. This dual status meant tomato medicine circulated through both elite and popular healing traditions,
Yes.
creating parallel development tracks that sometimes exchanged information but often remained separate. Historians still argue whether medicinal tomato uses represented genuine therapeutic discoveries or merely placebo effects reinforced by theoretical frameworks. You find evidence supporting both interpretations. Careful observations documenting symptom improvements following tomato treatments, but also clearly ineffective applications justified through elaborate theoretical explanations rather than practical results. Modern analysis suggests some historical tomato remedies contain genuinely active compounds, particularly those used topically for inflammation or internally for certain digestive complaints, while others likely produced benefits primarily through placebo effects or coincidental recovery during treatment. Medicinal tomato applications sometimes served as gateways to broader acceptance, retracking how regions with established tomato medicinal traditions typically developed culinary applications earlier than areas without such medical precedents. Once tomatoes gained familiarity through medicinal use, the psychological barrier to culinary experimentation lowered considerably. Having taken tomato preparations for my rheumatism these past 5 years without ill effect, writes an English gentleman in 1720, I recently ventured to try them prepared as a sauce with fish, finding them quite agreeable and suffering no consequences. These individual transitions from medicinal to culinary use multiplied across populations, gradually expanded tomato acceptance beyond strictly therapeutic applications. The commercial aspects of medicinal tomato preparations created economic incentives for challenging poison beliefs. You're examining advertisements for proprietary tomato medicines that proliferated in the 18th century, noting how manufacturers emphasized their products. Safety through careful processing while simultaneously claiming powerful therapeutic effects. Jenkins' patent tomato elixir safely prepared from the American fruit. Through our secret method that removes all harmful elements while preserving vital essences, proclaims one elaborate bottle label from 1735. These commercial preparations, often sold at premium prices, created financial motivation for reframing tomatoes as powerful but manageable substances rather than inherently dangerous poisons, gradually shifting public perception through persistent marketing. By the mid-18th century, medicinal tomato applications have created a widespread conceptual framework for understanding tomatoes, powerful but potentially beneficial plants when properly handled. You're reviewing a medical text from 1760 that represents this evolved perspective. The tomato, like many potent botanical agents, contains properties that prove harmful when improperly used, yet beneficial when correctly prepared. Modern experience demonstrates that proper ripening, appropriate preparation, and moderate consumption render it not merely safe, but actively beneficial for certain constitutions and conditions. This nuanced framing, emphasizing preparation and context rather than inherent danger, provided a face-saving bridge between earlier poison warnings and emerging acceptance, allowing medical authorities to revise their positions without entirely contradicting traditional cautions. You're browsing a London bookshop in 1697, leafing through a recently published herbal encyclopedia. Literary tomato terror jumps from the pages as you locate the tomato entry, complete with an ominous woodcut illustration showing a nightshade plant with skull and crossbones subtly incorporated into the border design. The love apple, being of the nightshade family, partakes of that family's dangerous qualities. The text warns in elaborate script. Cases have been documented of persons suffering grievous effects from consuming these fruits, particularly when unripe or prepared in pewter vessels. No specific poisoning incidents are cited. Yet the authoritative tone leaves little room for doubt, a printed example of how printed materials spread and reinforced tomato fears with an authority that verbal warnings could never achieve. The role of early print culture in disseminating and standardizing tomato misconceptions represents a fascinating case study in how new communication technologies can amplify existing beliefs. You're re-examining how handwritten herbals with limited circulation transformed into mass-produced botanical references that reached much wider audiences, creating unified versions of previously localized tomato beliefs. The printing press didn't create tomato suspicions, but it standardized them, transforming regional variations into seemingly authoritative consensus through the perceived legitimacy of published works. A warning that might have been recognized as one individual's opinion in manuscript form gained implicit authority simply by appearing in printed type with professional illustrations. One mainstream historical fact that significantly impacted literary tomato representations was the common practice of copying between botanical works without verification. You're comparing a series of herbals published between 1550 to 1700, tracing how tomato descriptions show clear evidence of authors borrowing from previous works, often copying warnings verbatim, while adding their own embellishments to demonstrate original contribution. This cumulative copying created the illusion of multiple independent sources confirming tomato dangers, when in reality many texts simply perpetuated information from a handful of original sources. The impressive consensus visible in library collections masked the circular nature of citation that reinforced initial misunderstandings, rather than challenging them through fresh observation. The visual representation of tomatoes in botanical illustrations subtly reinforced their dangerous associations. You're studying how illustrators frequently emphasize tomatoes' resemblance to their poisonous, nightshade relatives through artistic choices, highlighting similar leaf patterns, depicting unripe fruits alongside ripe ones, or placing tomato illustrations physically adjacent to known poisonous plants on the printed page. These visual juxtapositions created powerful psychological associations that text alone couldn't achieve, even as written descriptions gradually became more nuanced. Illustrations continued suggesting dangerous connections through visual similarities that readers absorbed almost unconsciously. A particularly quirky tidbit emerges when you investigate how fictional literature incorporated tomato themes. You're reading a 1712 romantic novel where a jealous antagonist attempts murder using love apples known to cause madness when consumed, reflecting how tomatoes had entered popular imagination as potential poisons. More surprising is a comic play from 1684 featuring a hypochondriac character who becomes convinced he's dying after accidentally consuming tomato sauce, spending 3 hilarious acts experiencing imaginary symptoms while doctors debate whether he can be saved. These fictional representations both reflected and reinforced popular tomato perceptions, creating a circular relationship between literature and belief that delayed acceptance despite growing evidence of tomato safety. The language used to describe tomatoes in print evolved in revealing ways. You're analyzing terminology across publications from different decades, noticing subtle shifts that reflected changing understanding. Early texts frequently employed terms like wolf peach and emphasized foreign origins with phrases like the Indians eat these, though they are unsafe for European constitutions. Later works gradually introduced more neutral terminology, with phrases like commonly believed to be unwholesome, replacing definitive statements of toxicity. By the early 18th century, some progressive publications began actively questioning traditional warnings. Despite common cautions, evidence of actual harm from properly ripened specimens remains elusive. These linguistic evolutions within printed works provide a documented timeline of gradually shifting perceptions. The accessibility gap between scientific and popular literature created parallel tomato narratives, recomparing advanced botanical journals discussing new evidence of tomato safety with popular household manuals. Continuing to repeat traditional warnings decades later, this information gap meant that revised scientific understanding remained confined to specialist readers, while outdated cautions continued circulating in more widely read sources. The educated botanist now recognizes certain varieties of ripened love apples as harmless, notes a scientific journal from 1720, while a household manual published the same year still warned. The prudent housewife admits no love apples to her kitchen, knowing their dangerous nature. This disparity helps explain why tomato acceptance proceeded unevenly across different social groups exposed to different types of literature. Historians still argue whether printed tomato warnings primarily reflected genuine beliefs or commercial incentives to maintain engaging content. You find evidence supporting both interpretations. Seemingly sincere cautions in medical texts with no obvious commercial motivation, but also sensationalized accounts in popular herbals, where dramatic warnings about exotic dangers would increase reader interest in sales. The truth likely varies by publications. Some authors genuinely believed and transmitted tomato fears, while others may have emphasized or exaggerated dangers to create more compelling content, particularly in commercial publications competing for readers' attention in the expanding print marketplace. The geographical circulation patterns of printed materials reinforced regional variations in tomato acceptance. You're mapping how botanical texts originated primarily in university centers and spread outward through commercial networks, creating uneven information distribution that followed trade routes rather than agricultural relevance. Mediterranean regions, despite their earlier tomato adoption, often had less developed vernacular printing industries than northern areas, creating a situation where regions most experienced with tomatoes produced fewer texts about them. Conversely, Northern European publishing centers produced abundant botanical works written by authors with limited first-hand tomato experience, creating information flows that sometimes contradicted practical knowledge in tomato-growing regions. The persistence of outdated information and repeatedly republished standard references created particularly stubborn obstacles to changing perceptions. You're examining how popular household manuals and farming guides were often republished for decades with minimal updates, preserving original tomato warnings long after new evidence emerged. Nicholas Culpeper's influential herbal, for instance, continued circulation in barely modified editions for over a century, maintaining its original tomato cautions despite evolving practical experience. This literary inertia meant many readers encountered tomato information that was already generations out of date, creating resistance to changing practices even as direct observation increasingly contradicted traditional warnings. By the mid-18th century, printed materials begin reflecting the growing contradictions between traditional tomato cautions and expanding practical experience. You're rereading a gardening manual from 1755 that demonstrates this transitional perspective. While older authorities universally condemned the love apple as unwholesome, if not actively poisonous, modern experience in southern regions demonstrates they may be safely consumed when fully ripened and properly prepared. The prudent gardener may experiment cautiously, beginning with the varieties having established safety records in Italian cookery. This tentative endorsement is balanced between traditional literary warnings and practical evidence, represents printed material's gradual adaptation to changing tomato perceptions, shift that would accelerate as empirical observation increasingly outweighed textual authority in European scientific and culinary thinking. You're sitting in a hushed church in rural France circa 1650, listening as the parish priest delivers a sermon warning against unfamiliar foods that God never intended for Christian consumption. Religious dimensions of tomato rejection added divine authority to botanical suspicions, creating powerful spiritual barriers to acceptance. The Lord provided all necessary fruits in Eden, the priest intoned solemnly, making foreign curiosities not merely unnecessary, but potentially contrary to divine intention. You observe parishioners nodding in agreement. The religious framing transforming vegetable preferences from mere personal choices into matters of spiritual significance. The theological interpretations of New World plants created fascinating religious contradictions. You're examining religious texts from the 16th and 17th centuries, discovering complex arguments about whether American species like tomatoes were part of God, as original creation, or represented something fundamentally different. Some theologians argued that New World plants must have existed in Eden, but remained unknown to Europeans as divine punishment following the Tower of Babel dispersion. Others suggested American species were newly created entities, either divine gifts, recently revealed, or potentially dangerous additions not part of God's original perfect plan. These theological uncertainties created a religious framework where caution toward unfamiliar plants could be justified as proper spiritual humility. One mainstream historical fact that significantly influenced religious perspectives was the tomato's absence from biblical texts. You're attending a theological discussion where scholars debate the spiritual implications of plants not mentioned in Scripture. The sacred texts describe the fruits available to the Israelites in considerable detail, argues one cleric, yet make no mention of these love apples, suggesting they were unknown in the Holy Land. This biblical silence created a religious authority vacuum regarding tomatoes, without clear scriptural guidance. Religious authorities relied on interpretive frameworks that tended toward caution about unfamiliar species, particularly those associated with pagan practices in their native lands. The tomato's early European name, love apple, created specific religious concerns regarding potential aphrodisiac properties. You're reading church warnings against foods believed to stimulate carnal desires, with tomatoes occasionally listed alongside other suspected passion-inducing substances. The so-called love apple, by its very name, suggests improper stimulation of the baser appetites. Warns a 1630 religious tract on food moderation. While no evidence suggested actual aphrodisiac effects, the name alone created associations that troubled religious authorities concerned with maintaining moral purity. This linguistic accident added an additional layer of religious suspicion, entirely separate from botanical safety concerns. A particularly quirky tidbit emerges when you investigate how religious calendar observations influenced early tomato acceptance patterns. You restudying how Mediterranean Catholic regions incorporated tomatoes into meatless fasting dishes required during Lent and other religious observances. The practical need for flavorful vegetable-based meals during numerous fasting days created incentives for experimenting with the new American fruit despite lingering suspicions. Neapolitan Cookbook from 1694 specifically recommends tomato sauce is suitable for fast days when meat is forbidden. It's providing satisfying flavor to otherwise plain vegetable dishes. This practical religious need for culinary variety during mandatory fasting periods helped accelerate tomato acceptance in Catholic regions, creating a fascinating instance where religious practice facilitated rather than hindered adoption. Regional variations in religious tomato interpretations followed broader denominational differences. You're comparing predominantly Catholic Southern European approaches with Protestant Northern European attitudes, discovering how different theological frameworks created distinct relationships with the controversial fruit. Catholic regions, with stronger traditions of natural theology that viewed nature as divine revelation, more readily accepted empirical evidence of tomato safety as revealing God's true intention. Protestant regions, particularly those influenced by Calvinist perspectives emphasizing human fallenness and worldly dangers, maintained more persistent suspicion of unfamiliar plants that might represent previously unknown threats in a fundamentally corrupted natural world. Missionary accounts of Native American tomato use created particular theological challenges. You're reading reports from Jesuit missionaries describing indigenous populations consuming tomatoes as dietary staples without apparent harm. These observations forced European religious authorities to reconcile conflicting interpretations. Either tomatoes were actually safe, despite European suspicions, or God had created different physiological tolerances in different human populations. Troubling proposition for theological frameworks, emphasizing fundamental human unity. Some religious writers resolved this contradiction by suggesting that New World peoples living in greater simplicity maintained stronger constitutions less corrupted by European refinements, allowing them to safely consume foods that would harm more delicate European bodies. Historians still argue whether religious tomato objections primarily reflected genuine theological concerns or simply provided convenient divine reinforcement for existing cultural preferences. You find evidence supporting both interpretations. Detailed theological treatises, seriously engaging with philosophical questions about creation and divine intention regarding unfamiliar species, but also seemingly opportunistic religious justifications for maintaining traditional food practices against foreign innovations. The reality likely combined sincere religious questioning with practical use of theological frameworks to reinforce cultural continuity religion, providing both genuine spiritual guidance and convenient justification for resistance to unfamiliar dietary changes. The symbolic associations between red foods and biblical imagery created additional layers of religious interpretation. You re-examining sermons that draw connections between tomatoes' vibrant red juice and blood, symbolism in Christian traditions, some warning that the resemblance represented a dangerous temptation, others suggesting potential sacrificial or redemptive symbolism. The red fruit that bleeds when cut, warns one particularly imaginative preacher, may serve as unholy parody of sacred blood, tempting the faithful through visual similarity to holy symbols. While such extreme interpretations remained minority perspectives, they demonstrate how visual and symbolic religious associations sometimes influence tomato reception beyond practical considerations of safety or nutrition. The gradual religious acceptance of tomatoes followed interesting theological justification patterns. You're reading later religious texts that reconcile increasing tomato consumption with earlier suspicions. Noting how theological frameworks evolve to accommodate changing practices, the Lord in His wisdom often reveals His creation's true nature gradually, explains a 1730 religious dietary guide, allowing initial caution to protect against potential dangers, while eventually revealing beneficial uses through careful experience and observation. This progressive revelation framework provided religious authorities with graceful means to adapt. Previous warnings, without undermining their fundamental authority, divine wisdom, had not changed. Merely human understanding of it had improved through divinely guided experience. By the mid-18th century, religious perspectives on tomatoes had largely shifted from opposition to cautious acceptance in most European regions. You're attending a harvest festival where a priest blesses the year's crops, including tomatoes growing in the church garden, a powerful symbolic endorsement that would have been unthinkable a century earlier. All of God's creations serve their purpose, the priest declares, including those revealed to us in later times through His providence. This theological reframing completes the religious rehabilitation of tomatoes from suspicious foreign Intruders, too, accepted members of divine creation, a transformation that parallels their journey from feared poisons to valued foods in European cultural understanding more broadly. You're observing a fashionable dinner party in a Parisian townhouse circa 1720, noting with interest how the elaborate meal concludes with a small dish of tomatoes presented as an exotic delicacy. Class divisions in tomato consumption created distinctive patterns of acceptance and rejection that often had more to do with social signaling than actual safety concerns. "From my gardens," announces the wealthy host, proudly grown in our new glass house, using seeds obtained directly from Naples. The guests sample the red fruit with performative caution that gradually gives way to enthusiastic approval, their response shaped more by the social context of elite experimentation than by the actual flavor experience. The relationship between social status and food innovation created fascinating patterns in tomato adoption. You're comparing food practices across social classes, discovering how different positions in the social hierarchy influenced willingness to experiment with suspicious foods. Counterintuitively, both the highest and lowest social classes often led tomato adoption, while the middle classes typically showed greatest resistance. The aristocracy could afford to risk experimental foods as displays of cosmopolitan sophistication and access to novelty, while the poor sometimes adopted tomatoes out of practical necessity when other options were limited. The middle classes most invested in demonstrating proper adherence to established norms often proved most conservative in maintaining traditional warnings against suspicious foods. One mainstream historical fact that influenced class-based tomato patterns was the significant cost difference between growing tomatoes as ornamentals versus as food crops. You retouring estate gardens where tomatoes grow in small, decorative quantities versus market gardens producing them for culinary use, noting the different scales and methods involved. Aristocratic households could afford to maintain tomatoes as primarily ornamental curiosities for decades, occasionally experimenting with culinary applications without economic pressure. This luxury of low-stakes experimentation allowed elite households to gradually develop tomato culinary applications through trial and error, eventually creating prestigious dishes that would later influence broader acceptance once techniques and varieties were perfected. The performance of sophistication through novel food acceptance created distinctive elite tomato practices. You're re-attending an aristocratic dinner where tomatoes feature in an elaborate multi-layered terrina presentation requiring significant kitchen labor and specialized equipment unavailable to lower classes. This performative complexity transformed the formerly suspicious vegetable into a marker of refinement and cosmopolitan knowledge. The preparation method comes from Sicily, explains the host, though our chef has naturally improved upon their rustic approach. This class-based recontextualization stripped tomatoes of peasant or foreign associations, recasting them as sophisticated ingredients when properly transformed through elite culinary techniques. A particularly quirky tidbit emerges when you investigate how gender-influenced class-based tomato acceptance. You're comparing men's and women's dining societies, discovering that women's groups often proved more adventurous with tomato experimentation across all social classes. Female-authored household manuals included tomato recipes earlier than their male-authored counterparts, while women's correspondents more frequently exchanged information about successful tomato cultivation and preparation. This gender pattern likely reflected women's practical responsibility for daily food provision, and their communication networks focused on household management. The most innovative early tomato recipes often circulated through personal correspondence between female household managers long before appearing in published cookbooks. Regional variations in class-based tomato patterns reflected broader social structures. You're comparing Mediterranean regions with more fluid class boundaries against Northern European societies with more rigid hierarchies, noting how these social differences influence tomato diffusion between classes. In Italy and Spain, culinary techniques and ingredients moved relatively easily between aristocratic kitchens and peasant cooking, creating bidirectional influence where elite refinements and practical peasant applications cross-fertilized tomato usage. In more stratified northern societies, the association of tomatoes with specific class contexts created stronger barriers to cross-class adoption, with each social level maintaining distinct tomato relationships that rarely influence practices above or below their station. The servant class played a particularly important role in transmitting tomato knowledge between social levels. You're interviewing cooks who moved between households, discovering how their experience created crucial knowledge bridges. A chef trained in an Italian aristocratic kitchen might later work for a prosperous merchant family, bringing tomato preparation techniques to this new context. Similarly, household servants from rural areas sometimes introduced tomato growing and preservation methods from peasant traditions into urban middle-class households. These vertical knowledge transfers through domestic staff created important exceptions to otherwise strong class divisions in tomato practices, accelerating adoption across social boundaries despite cultural resistance. Historians still argue whether class-based tomato acceptance patterns primarily reflected practical economic factors or social performance considerations. You find evidence supporting both interpretations. Clear documentation of cost and availability constraints that limited lower-class tomato access in many regions, but also writings revealing how tomato attitudes functioned as social markers signaling class belonging. The truth clearly combines both practical and performative elements. Material conditions created the initial framework for class differences, which cultural practices then elaborated into complex social signaling systems that persisted even when practical constraints eventually diminished. The medicinal context provided a particularly important class-crossing pathway for tomato familiarization. You're observing how tomato-based treatments sometimes reached patients across class lines through physician recommendations, creating exposure that later influenced culinary acceptance. Upper-class physicians occasionally prescribed tomato preparations to middle and lower-class patients, particularly for inflammatory conditions where the cooling properties attributed to tomatoes seemed beneficial. These medical applications created opportunities for people to experience tomatoes in controlled contexts with authoritative approval, potentially reducing resistance to later culinary uses. Having taken tomato tincture for my rheumatism on doctor's orders, notes a shopkeeper's diary from 1715. I found myself less fearful of trying the fruit in a sauce some months later. The timing of tomato adoption across social classes created interesting historical documentation patterns. You're examining household accounts, personal diaries, and institutional records tracking. When different social groups began regular tomato purchases or cultivation, elite households typically left more extensive written records, creating an archival bias that sometimes exaggerates their innovation role while underrepresenting lower-class practices that may have occurred simultaneously, but with less documentation. Contemporary accounts occasionally hint at this documentation gap, as when an Italian aristocrat notes with surprise in 1695 that the peasants near Naples have apparently been consuming these fruits regularly for some time, though physicians still debate their wholesomeness, suggesting popular adoption sometimes preceded elite recognition. By the mid-18th century, class-based tomato patterns have created distinct culinary traditions that reflect social divisions, while gradually moving toward broader acceptance. You're comparing cookbooks targeted at different social levels, finding how tomato recipes appear first in elite collections, then in middle-class household guides, creating a documented trickle-down pattern that likely oversimplifies more complex adoption realities. What's clear is that by 1750, tomatoes have developed class-specific culinary identities, elite preparations emphasizing refinement and complexity. Middle-class applications focusing on respectable but accessible techniques, and lower-class uses prioritizing practicality and preservation. These class-based culinary approaches would eventually cross-fertilize to create the diverse tomato traditions that later generations would inherit. The class origins, often forgotten as formerly elite preparations, became democratized, and formerly peasant applications gained gourmet recognition. You're attending a public demonstration at the Royal Society in London in 1774, where a distinguished botanist methodically dissects a tomato plant while delivering a systematic refutation of traditional toxicity beliefs. Scientific redemption represents the final chapter in the tomato's long journey from suspected poison to accepted food. As empirical evidence gradually overwhelms centuries of misunderstanding, note the distinct morphological differences, the scientist explains, pointing to specific cellular structures visible under a microscope that separate edible Solanum lycopersicum from its genuinely toxic relatives. The audience of natural philosophers nods appreciatively in this age of Enlightenment reason. Scientific evidence has become more persuasive than either traditional warnings or practical experience alone. The application of systematic scientific methodology to tomato investigation transformed understanding more thoroughly than casual observation could achieve. You're reviewing experimental notebooks from early botanists who applied the emerging scientific method to test tomato properties, documenting controlled feeding trials with laboratory animals, chemical analyses of fruit components, and comparative studies of tomato varieties against known poisonous plants. These structured investigations provided quantifiable evidence that gradually replaced anecdotal beliefs with verifiable knowledge. A particularly influential 1735 experiment involved feeding increasing quantities of tomatoes to dogs over several months, with detailed records showing no detectable negative effects, even at consumption levels far exceeding typical human usage. One mainstream historical fact that accelerated scientific tomato redemption was the development of Linnaean taxonomy, which created a more precise classification framework. You're examining how Carl Linnaeus's revolutionary system, introduced in his 1753 Species Plantarum, helped clarify tomato relationships by establishing the formal binomial Solanum lycopersicum. This scientific naming placed tomatoes firmly within the nightshade family while acknowledging their distinctiveness, allowing botanists to move beyond simplistic guilty by association, reasoning toward more nuanced understanding of relationships between related but distinct species. Taxonomic clarity made it possible to acknowledge tomatoes' nightshade connections, while simultaneously recognizing their unique properties. The development of more sophisticated chemical analysis techniques proved particularly important for tomato scientific understanding. You're observing early chemical tests being performed on tomato extracts, As researchers isolate and identify specific compounds present in the fruit, these analyses allowed scientists to confirm that while tomato leaves and stems contained solanine and tomatine, the ripened fruits contained these compounds in such minimal quantities that they posed no threat to human health. This chemical evidence provided objective confirmation that traditional warnings had contained. Partial truth tomato plants did indeed contain toxic compounds, but not in the edible portions when properly ripened. A particularly quirky tidbit emerges when you investigate how public scientific demonstrations became theatrical events that dramatically accelerated tomato acceptance. You're attending a famous 1820 performance in Salem, Massachusetts, where Colonel Robert Gibbon Johnson allegedly consumed a basket of tomatoes on courthouse steps before a crowd expecting to witness his death. While this particular event is likely apocryphal. Similar public demonstrations did occur across Europe decades earlier. These scientific performances combined entertainment with education, creating memorable public spectacles that influenced popular opinion more effectively than scholarly publications alone could achieve. The involvement of prestigious scientific institutions lent crucial credibility to tomato rehabilitation. You're reviewing proceedings from the French Academy of Sciences, the Royal Society, and other influential scientific bodies that gradually published papers supporting tomato safety throughout the 18th century. These institutional endorsements carried significant weight in changing elite opinion, which subsequently influenced broader public perception. When the French Academy officially declared tomatoes wholesome for consumption in a 1765 report following systematic investigation, it provided authoritative contradiction to centuries of suspicion that even non-scientists found difficult to dismiss. The institutional authority of science increasingly outweighed traditional warning as the late Enlightenment elevated empirical evidence above inherited wisdom. The economic incentives for scientific investigation created interesting research patterns. You're tracking funding sources for tomato studies, discovering how agricultural societies and commercial growers increasingly sponsored research aimed at demonstrating tomato safety and benefits. As tomato cultivation became commercially significant in some regions, financial support became available for scientists willing to investigate questions relevant to expanding markets. This economic dimension didn't necessarily bias findings, but it did direct scientific attention toward specific questions about tomato properties and away from other botanical investigations without clear commercial applications. The intersection of scientific inquiry with economic interests accelerated the pace of tomato research compared to plants without similar commercial potential. Historians still argue whether scientific tomato redemption primarily drove changing attitudes or simply provided authoritative confirmation for shifts already underway through practical experience. You find evidence supporting both interpretations. Laboratory studies preceding adoption in some regions, but also scientific investigations. Following rather than leading acceptance in areas where practical experience had already established tomato safety, the relationship between scientific understanding and popular practice. Clearly operated bidirectionally practical experience raised questions that science investigated. While scientific findings influenced practices in regions still maintaining traditional suspicions, the publication and translation patterns of scientific tomato studies created uneven information distribution. You're remapping how research conducted in Italian and French scientific communities circulated primarily within those language regions before eventually being translated into English and German decades later. This linguistic lag meant scientific evidence supporting tomato safety reached different regions at different times, creating knowledge disparities that reinforced existing regional variations in acceptance. Northern European scientific communities sometimes continued citing outdated tomato warnings from their own traditional sources even after. Mediterranean researchers had published contradictory findings, simply because language barriers delayed awareness of new evidence. The gradual scientific rehabilitation of tomatoes reflected broader Enlightenment shifts in authority from traditional to empirical knowledge. You're reading scientific literature that increasingly questions inherited wisdom about numerous subjects. It's not just tomatoes, when that wisdom contradicts direct observation. This methodological revolution, prioritizing what can be personally verified through systematic observation over what has been transmitted through textual authorities, created the intellectual conditions necessary for overturning centuries of tomato misconceptions. The tomato scientific redemption thus represents not merely correction of one specific botanical error, but part of a fundamental transformation in how Europeans determined what constituted reliable knowledge about the natural world. By the early 19th century, scientific consensus regarding tomato safety has been firmly established, though popular awareness of this consensus varies considerably by region and social class. You're comparing scientific publications with popular household guides, noting the significant time lag between scientific conclusions and their diffusion into general practice. In 1806, Botanical Encyclopedia matter-of-factly states, "The once common belief that tomatoes possessed poisonous properties has been thoroughly disproven through systematic investigation, with all credible scientific authorities now recognizing their wholesomeness when properly ripened, yet contemporary household manuals. Some regions still include cautious language about tomato preparation, demonstrating how scientific redemption often preceded popular redemption by decades of pattern that would repeat with many other foods as scientific understanding increasingly diverged from traditional practice throughout the modern era." You're strolling through a Parisian market in the early 1900s, smiling at the mountains of tomatoes being eagerly purchased by shoppers of all social classes. Cultural transformation has thoroughly rehabilitated the once feared fruit, completing a remarkable journey from suspected poison to culinary essential. The vendors call out prices for different varieties, some promoting firm ones perfect for slicing, others recommending juicier specimens ideal for sauce. No hint remains of the centuries-long suspicion that once surrounded these bright red fruits. In fact, the market women seem mildly amused when you mention the old poison beliefs. Imagine being afraid of tomatoes. One laughs, tossing an extra one into your basket. Next, you'll tell me people once feared potatoes and chocolate too. The complete cultural rehabilitation of tomatoes represents one of history's most dramatic food perception reversals. You're comparing European cookbooks from 1600 and 1900, marveling at the transformation from complete absence or cautious mentions to central ingredient status in hundreds of recipes. By the late 19th century, tomatoes had become so thoroughly integrated into European cuisine that many signature national dishes now considered traditional French ratatouille, Spanish gazpacho, Italian pasta sauces would have been impossible before tomato acceptance. This culinary centrality created a kind of collective amnesia about tomatoes' controversial past. As each generation increasingly viewed them as traditional ingredients rather than relatively recent adoptions. One mainstream historical fact that cemented tomato cultural transformation was the development of commercial canning technology in the 19th century. You're touring an early tomato canning factory, watching a summer's abundance is preserved for year-round consumptional, revolutionary development that permanently altered tomato availability. Canned tomatoes democratized access across seasons, social classes, and regions, creating unprecedented continuity of supply that allowed tomatoes to become dietary staples rather than seasonal luxuries. This industrial preservation capacity removed one of the final practical barriers to complete tomato integration, particularly in northern regions where fresh tomatoes remained expensive seasonal items, but canned products could be affordably imported throughout the year. The evolution of tomato varieties through selective breeding dramatically influenced cultural adoption. You're visiting agricultural research stations where scientists systematically develop tomatoes with specific characteristics: larger fruits, thicker flesh, reduced acidity, earlier ripening, and enhanced disease resistance. These breeding programs, accelerating throughout the 19th century, transformed tomatoes from their more acidic, seedy ancestors into fruits optimized for modern preferences and growing conditions. Improved varieties addressed many of the practical challenges that had limited early adoption, particularly in northern regions where traditional varieties ripened poorly. These agricultural innovations completed the material conditions necessary for tomatoes to transition from occasional curiosities to agricultural staples across Europe. A particularly quirky tidbit emerges when you investigate how completely some regions forgot their former tomato suspicions. You're interviewing elderly residents in southern Italian villages who expressed genuine disbelief when told their great-grandparents likely avoided tomatoes. Impossible, declares one 8-year-old woman preparing sauce from a family recipe she claims dates back centuries. Italians have always used tomatoes. They are the foundation of our cooking. This historical amnesia, the complete replacement of actual food history with invented tradition, represents a fascinating example of collective memory reconstruction. By 1900, many Mediterranean communities had retroactively extended tomato use backward in their culinary history, creating origin myths about ancient tomato recipes that archaeological evidence clearly contradicts. The global spread of European cuisines during colonial expansion ironically helped cement tomato acceptance in their European places of origin. You're examining how Italian tomato sauces became popular in America, were adapted to local tastes and ingredients, then reflected back to Italy through immigrant contact and tourism as evidence of tomatoes' central role in authentic Italian identity. This culinary feedback loop where adopted ingredients become so associated with particular cuisines that their relatively recent introduction is forgotten. Accelerated tomato integration by creating external cultural validation. When foreign visitors specifically sought tomato dishes as quintessential European experiences, local culinary practices responded by emphasizing these preparations, reinforcing their central cultural position. The medical reputation of tomatoes underwent complete reversal during this transformation period. You're reviewing health publications from different decades, tracing how tomatoes transitioned from suspected poisons to neutral foods to actively promoted health items. By the late 19th century, medical journals discussed tomatoes' contribution to nutrition, with early vitamins research in the early 20th century identifying their significant vitamin C content. This nutritional rehabilitation completed tomatoes' journey through medical opinion from dangerous to beneficial, creating scientific endorsement for their dietary centrality. The discovery of tomatoes' antioxidant properties and potential cancer-fighting compounds in the later 20th century would further cement this positive health association, making previous poison fears seem even more implausible to modern audiences. Historians still argue whether tomato cultural transformation resulted primarily from top-down influences or bottom-up forces. You find evidence supporting both interpretations. clearly documented institutional efforts to promote tomato consumption for agricultural and economic reasons, but also grassroots adoption patterns driven by practical advantages and flavor preferences independent of official encouragement. The reality clearly combined multiple influence directions. Scientific evidence enabled commercial development, which increased availability, which allowed broader taste exposure, which created popular demand. In a mutually reinforcing cycle that ultimately transformed cultural perception more thoroughly than any single factor could have achieved, the tomato's visual and aesthetic qualities contributed significantly to its cultural transformation. You're examining how tomatoes became prominent in still life paintings, decorative serving dishes specifically designed for tomato presentation, and early color photography that frequently featured their vibrant red hue. The tomato's visual appeal, once considered suspiciously intense, gradually became appreciated as a desirable aesthetic quality that brightened meals and market displays. This visual rehabilitation paralleled culinary acceptance, with tomatoes' distinctive appearance transitioning from warning sign to attractive feature. By the early 20th century, tomatoes had become so visually normalized that their distinctive color was used to sell other products, with tomato red described as appetizing rather than alarming. The tomato's transformation experience created a template for other once suspicious foods. You're comparing tomato acceptance patterns with similar trajectories followed by potatoes, corn, and peppers, American plants that initially faced European resistance before achieving culinary centrality. Each followed remarkably similar paths. Initial suspicion based on unfamiliarity and botanical misunderstanding. Gradual experimentation driven by practical necessity or elite fashion. Scientific investigation confirming safety. Commercial development improving varieties and availability. Finally, complete cultural integration that erased memory of former controversy. Its repeated pattern suggests fundamental mechanisms in how human societies incorporate novel foods of process, relevant even to contemporary food innovations facing similar resistance cycles. By the early 20th century, tomatoes have completed their remarkable cultural journey from deadly nightshade relatives to essential ingredients in numerous European culinary traditions. You're rereading a 1925 European agricultural report that states, "Tomato production now ranks among the continent's most valuable vegetable crops, with consumption levels continuing to rise across all regions and social classes. Modern Europeans would find it difficult to imagine their cuisine without this versatile fruit, now so thoroughly integrated into our culinary identity." This matter-of-fact assessment, making no reference to former controversies, perfectly captures tomatoes' complete cultural transformation, a remarkable reversal accomplished so thoroughly that even the memory of previous fears has largely disappeared from popular consciousness. The story of tomato transformation from feared poison to beloved staple reminds you that what seems most natural and traditional in our food culture often has complex histories of resistance and adaptation behind it. You feel a gentle wave of relaxation flowing through you as you consider this remarkable journey, how something once approached with genuine terror gradually became so accepted that the fear itself seems incomprehensible to later generations. While your thoughts drift deeper into this soothing historical perspective, you begin to appreciate how fluid human certainties really are. The absolute conviction with which people once avoided tomatoes, believing science and tradition supported their fears, gradually dissolved as new evidence and experiences accumulated. There's something profoundly comforting about this pattern, the way humanity can eventually correct its misunderstandings, however long that process might take. Your breathing slows as you imagine those first brave tomato eaters. The gradual spread of new recipes. The patient scientific investigations that finally confirmed what practical experience had begun to suggest. The story becomes a gentle reminder that many things we fear or resist today might someday be embraced as ordinary, their former controversy forgotten by our descendants, who will wonder how we could have ever thought otherwise. Let this historical perspective carry you towards sleep now, this awareness that human knowledge evolves continually, that today's certainties may become tomorrow's outdated notions. There is a peaceful acceptance in recognizing that we are all part of this ongoing flow of discovery and adaptation, participating in cultural transformations we may not even recognize as they happen around us. Rest easy in this gentle understanding, allowing the weight of history's patient unfolding to lull you toward. Dreams perhaps filled with vibrant red fruits that once inspired fear, but now bring only nourishment and pleasure. Sweet dreams.